everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors. And today's contract tip is a continuation of the changes that the Georgia Association of Realtors, or GAR, has made to the contract package for 2022. And today, what I want to talk to you about is the new form. There's only one new form that GAR has come up with, and that's what I want to talk about. So the new form is actually F733, and it is called the Binding Agreement Date Confirmation Amendment. Ooh, that's a mouthful, but it has to do with a big topic that, for a lot of reasons, gets very much misunderstood by a lot of agents, regardless of their time in the business. So first, let me show you what that form actually looks like. So here is the form. Again, this is a brand new form for 2022. It is F733, and it is called the Binding Agreement Date Confirmation Amendment. And let me go over this form, and then I'll show you in the purchase and sale agreement where this is referenced. I'll have a brief conversation on why this is important. And then I think I'm going to do a longer contract tip on binding agreement date. But this is the form, and you reference the purchase and sale agreement, the buyer and seller's names, the address. And it states that the binding agreement date, all parties confirm that the binding agreement date in the above reference transaction is, and you fill in the binding agreement date. Then it reiterates a definition of binding agreement date. I say reiterate because this is defined in the purchase and sale agreement that the buyer and seller have already signed. But it states the binding agreement date shall be the date when a party to this transaction who has accepted an offer or counteroffer to buy or sell real property delivers notice of that acceptance to the party who made the offer or counteroffer in accordance with the notices section of this agreement. Notice of the binding agreement date may be delivered by either party or the broker. And when you see broker, it also means affiliated licensee working with or representing such party to the other party. If notice of the accurate binding agreement date is delivered, the party receiving the notice shall sign the same and immediately return it to the other party. In signing below, the parties acknowledge the above reference binding agreement date is accurate, is hereby incorporated into the above referenced agreement, and shall control over any other conflicting binding agreement date previously referenced elsewhere in the agreement, i.e., on a purchase and sale agreement or on a counter offer. And then the buyer and seller sign it. Now, why is this important, or where is this referenced in the purchase and sale agreement? In the 2022 purchase and sale agreement, F201, there is a new section. There's a couple of new sections which prompted the creation of this new form. So under paragraph C, notice of binding agreement date. Paragraph CJ, that has been in there where it talks about the binding agreement date. Now, the important thing to remember, the definition of a binding agreement between the parties is not an accepted contract, but notice of acceptance. Easy way to remember who fills in the binding agreement date, which side of the transaction. The easy way to remember this is the party, the side, buyer side, seller side, making the last offer or counter offer is the party that binds the contract. Because if you have, well, I'll give an example in a minute. And what was added for 2022, it states, so that's the definition of the binding agreement. And that was also reiterated on that new form, the amendment. Now it states, notwithstanding any other provision, I'm sorry, let me back up, under no authority to bind. It states, in the event of a dispute over the binding agreement date, I'm on the last part of paragraph C, 4I. In the event of a dispute over the binding agreement date, it shall be resolved by court arbitrator having jurisdiction over the dispute by written agreement of the buyer and seller, or by the holder, but only in making a reasonable interpretation of the agreement in dispersing the earnest money. Then it goes on to say, under notice of binding agreement date, notwithstanding any other provision to the contrary, it is the express intent of this section that one, a broker or licensee involved in the real estate transaction may perform the ministerial task of filling in the binding agreement date, and two, send a fully signed purchase and sale agreement with a specific binding agreement date included. That one of the parties has agreed to constitutes notice of the binding agreement date to the other party. Then there is a whole brand new section, brand new paragraph, paragraph C4K, objection to binding agreement date. If the buyer and seller object to the date entered as the binding agreement date, then within 1 day from receiving notice of the binding agreement date, the party objecting shall send notice of the objection to the other party. The objection shall be resolved by the written amendment between the buyer and the seller by executing a binding agreement date confirmation, F733. The absence of an agreement on the binding agreement date shall not render this agreement unenforceable. So the agreement, the purchase and sale agreement, is still enforceable. The failure of a party to timely object will result in the parties accepting the binding agreement date as entered. So there's a lot packed in here. A couple things. It says that the parties agree to the binding agreement date by written agreement. So the very last part of the purchase and sale agreement is a place to fill in the binding agreement date. If there is an objection, the party needs to make an objection and it gets resolved in one of those ways. Another way that demonstrates agreement in writing between the parties is this new form, F733, binding agreement date confirmation amendment. That's a mouthful. Why is this important? This is important for a couple of reasons. Well, for a lot of reasons. But the binding agreement date is important because all of the contingencies are timed from that date, except for there's a backup offer, but that's a whole nother contract tip. So for purposes of counting, the binding agreement date is day zero for counting. And I've done a video a while back on that. I'll link that below. But for purposes of counting, the binding agreement date is day 0. Why are the contingency timeframes important? Well, if a party is going to terminate a contract and they send notice of termination prior to the expiration of a contingency, then generally speaking, their earnest money is protected and they'll get the earnest money back. Usually it's a buyer that has the contingencies. If a buyer terminates a contract and sends notice of termination after the expiration of a contingency time frame, then generally speaking, the seller will get that earnest money as liquidated damages because the buyer will have defaulted on the contract. So the binding agreement date is important in essence for protection of earnest money for a buyer should a buyer terminate a contract based on a contingency. Why does this get confused? It gets confused because of people filling in the wrong binding agreement date and not understanding what a binding agreement is. So let me give you a quick example, and then I'm going to stop it here and I'll do a longer video tip on this whole scenario. But just for example, because this ties in with time limits too. So I'm going to do a whole nother tip on this, but I wanted to introduce you to this new form. Let me give you a sample of why this is extremely important. Let's say a buyer and a seller, a buyer writes an offer to a seller. Let's say the seller is going to sign it. So the buyer writes an offer to the seller. The buyer's agent sends it to the seller's agent. In the offer, let's say there is a 5-day due diligence period. The seller's agent sends it to the seller. The seller's at work. The seller comes home from work. They sign it tonight. Let's just say today is Wednesday, January 5th. Let's say that the sellers sign it tonight and they send it back to their agent, their seller's agent. Their seller's agent, however, does not send so at this point, do we have a binding contract? No, we have an accepted contract, but we do not have a binding contract. The terms are not yet binding upon the parties because notice of acceptance has not been conveyed back to the buyer. The buyer does not know at this point if they are going to get a counter offer or a fully executed contract. So let's say, again, the seller signs it tonight, sends it back to their agent. Their agent, however, does not send it back to the buyer's agent until tomorrow, Thursday, January 6th. The actual binding agreement date of the contract will be January 6th. And that I can demonstrate that. I'll do that in another video based on the notices section of the purchase and sale agreement. Let's say again, we had a 5-day due diligence period. So let's say that the buyer sends a notice of termination to the seller on Tuesday, January 11th. Let me show you I don't know if you can see this or not. You can't see it. All right. So they send a notice of termination based on due diligence to the seller on Tuesday, January 11th. Well, the due diligence period was 5 days. The seller thinks that the binding agreement date was the 5th because that's when they signed it. So they think that the 5th would, so from the seller's perspective, which is wrong in my example, they think, so the 5th would have been day 0. So 5 days would have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They think, the seller thinks that the binding agreement date ended at 11:59 p.m. on Monday the 10th. However, the agent did not send the accepted contract back to the buyer until the 6th. So notice of acceptance was actually on the 6th. So the 6th would have been day 0, not the 5th. And 5 days from the 6th is the 11th. So the issue comes in, the buyer has sent their notice of termination to the seller on the 11th, requesting that they get the earnest money back. The seller doesn't sign it because they think the buyer is a day out of due diligence period. So what happens is the holder is going to have to do an interpretation of the contract and go through. And again, I'm going to do a whole nother video tip on this, but it's very important because of the time frames for termination. Did the termination occur within the allowed contingency time frame, or was the termination a default after the contingency time frame? The time to work out the binding agreement date is not when this issue comes up and everybody's arguing over who gets the earnest money. The time to make sure that all parties are on the same page for the binding agreement date is at the time that the parties go under contract and go binding. Again, the purpose of this brief video is just to introduce you to that form, which is GAR F 733 Amendment to Binding Agreement Date Confirmation Amendment. Stay tuned after I get through with all of the additional changes to the GAR Purchase and Sale or GAR contract package for 2022. I'm going to go back and go back to videos with a lot more explanation of all this, because this topic gets a little more interesting when we have to deal with time limits and who fills it in and what happens if you receive it with the date already filled in and all kinds of issues. So I will address that at a later video. Stay tuned. Woo! Thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned for more video tips on the changes that GAR has made to the 2022 contract package. And we do have continuing education classes on this. I will link all of that information below. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Thank you guys.